Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Christchurch, or the House as we call it here. As you just heard, the organisers are the Freedom Association, with generous assistance from the Disraeli Society, whom I would like to thank Isabel. The Hampden Trust is hosting, and it's sponsored by the Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy, to whom we are exceedingly grateful. This evening is part of the 800th anniversary celebrations commemorating King John setting his seal upon Magna Carta on the banks of the Thames at Runnymede in 1215. And I'd also add, it's the 40th anniversary of Norris and Ross McWhirter and sundry other libertarians setting their seal upon what has become the Freedom Association, which has campaigned ever since 1975 to further the cause of political liberty and personal freedom, rights which Magna Carta defined for the first time as belonging to the free men of our kingdom. What has Magna Carta ever done for us? Well, I suppose a little bit like what the Romans have ever done for us. It depends who you ask. Ask a lawyer, and they'll tell you that it's a fine historical document, but of no legal force whatsoever. In fact, if you quote it to a High Court judge, you're liable to be laughed out of court, quite literally. If you ask a philosopher, they'll tell you about, Sir Isaiah Berlin, and they'll cavil with you over whether the barons won freedom from or freedom to. Ask a theologian, and they'll tell you about the primacy of the laws of God and the imperative of the independence of the church from the state. Ask a historian, and they'll go on and on and on about plots and revolutions and ages when it was dangerous to be king, sometimes more dangerous to be a baron, and the whole thing will get tied up in knots of vipers. Ask a politician, and they'll tell you exactly what you want to hear. With increasing concerns for our liberties, in an age where we have an emerging Snoopers Charter, as it's called, or David Cameron's voluntary participation in the European arrest warrant, this debate could not be more relevant or more timely. Our speakers tonight are Ewen Stuart, Consulting Director of Global Britain, and Renate, Samson, Chief Executive Officer of Big Brother Watch, both of whom work tirelessly for our freedoms to guard them. We're also here to launch Ewen's new book, Magna Carta, today. I think you've all been given a copy of it. It has been sent, courtesy of the Hampden Trust and I think others, to every school in England and Wales, free of charge. Ewen, I understand, uses a new translation of the Charter, seeking to further the understanding of it and the importance of it for the fundamentals of our English legal system and contemporary matters of law and society. The format this evening: I'll give each speaker about 10 minutes, give or take my levels of tolerance, to make their case. It'll be followed by a few minutes where they may wish to offer rebuttals or we may seek clarifications. That will be followed by about 20 to 25 minutes of questions from you, which I will come to in due course. Ladies and gentlemen, could you welcome our first guest, please? Renate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. I kind of don't really know what to say, if I'm honest. I think you pretty much summed it up. Let's give it a go. Back in 2008, YouGov conducted a poll which found that nearly half of the UK population didn't know what Magna Carta was. With this being the 800th anniversary of the Great Charter, I thought I would test a few people to see if they're any more aware, as a way of discussing, as a way of discovering rather, what people thought it had actually done for us. So, I asked a random group of my friends what they thought Magna Carta was. The majority of them tended to shrug and say one of the following. Well, gave us our rights, didn't it? Gave us freedom. Did it give power to the individual? Did it create the concept of democracy? It's about innocent until proven guilty. Well, actually, none of these points are entirely true. They are almost all, I would say, part of the myth of Magna Carta. The reality of Magna Carta is that it gave a little more power to the barons over the king and some reassurance and protection for free men, as mentioned earlier. Free men at that time, however, totalled only 1 in 7 of the male population, and certainly didn't take into consideration women or children. Hardly the document, therefore, freeing every man, woman and child from the despotic shackles which many of us would like to define it as. So how then has it become this reverential document which we celebrate and yet so often misquote and clearly misunderstand? Well, to my mind, through the little bit of reading that I've been doing, I would say that there are 2 key moments in history which have given Magna Carta this important status that it has today, and which I hope can answer a little bit as to what it's actually done for us. Here in the UK, we have Sir Edward Coke to thank. Coke was a hugely influential man of the 16th century. He was a barrister who became Solicitor General and also Speaker of the House of Commons. He was a man of great importance in the reign of both James I and Charles I. Coke's influence on the story of Magna Carta revolves in part around 2 of the clauses of the document which are still relevant and often cited, probably more in the US than here, today, namely clauses 39 and 40. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. To none will we sell, to none deny or delay right or justice. Coke took these crucial provisions of the Magna Carta, the provisions which clearly protected our liberties, and used them to define any invasion of personal liberty by the Crown as completely unlawful. He in effect gave all of us freedom from the king, much like the barons had had back at Runnymede. So with this document, this petition of rights that Coke put together, he took history and he made it relevant to the day, cementing for the first time an element of Magna Carta into our law. The impact of this was so huge that it influenced the drafting of the US Constitution and the American Bill of Rights. 9 of the 26 provisions in that document can be traced back to Magna Carta. But more importantly, it influenced the creation of the American Supreme Court as the ultimate arbiter of the Constitution through the concept of equal justice under the law. With that move, Magna Carta was taken further than we had and have ever done. Magna Carta had been the acorn which, thanks to the efforts of Coke and the Founding Fathers, became a fully fledged tree, providing leaves of freedom, liberty and rights for the common man. But then how does Magna Carta affect us today? Well, the concept of restraint on the arbitrary use of power is what most of us would define as our liberty from the state. But sadly, since 9/11, this idea of individual liberty and no man being above the law has been somewhat challenged. In the aftermath of the attack on the Twin Towers, a declaration was made that defined us, along with America, as being at war, a war on terror. And during wartime, ordinary rules do not apply. Certain rights and freedoms are placed on hold. This concept of a war on terror, a war which you could argue can never be won, has changed the very nature of our country. So far, the 21st century has seen security being given greater importance than liberty, freedom and rights. We have seen examples of action by governments which directly breached clauses 39 and 40 of Magna Carta that I read out a moment ago. Notably, the indefinite detention of terror suspects in Guantanamo and the argument about 90-day detention without charge, which took place in our very own Parliament during the leadership of Tony Blair. Security is, of course, an essential aspect of society, but equally so is freedom. Freedom defines who we are. The freedoms we have in this country are what make us a great nation. A nation which, frankly, throughout history, I believe, has punched well above its weight for its size, and which is, I believe, revered around the world for being fair. But sadly, today, I see these freedoms and this idea of fairness hugely under threat. A few weeks ago, when the government announced new laws to tackle extremism, the Prime Minister stated that, "For too long, we have been a passively tolerant society, saying to our citizens, as long as you obey the law, we will leave you alone." He went on to define this tolerance, an idea of abiding by the law, as a failed approach, as it has opened the door to extremism and extremist influences. We don't have a definition of what extremism is. Many of us may think we can define it, but without a clear definition, we can never actually be sure. Without a clear definition, any one of us could be called an extremist. After all, the Green Party peer, Jenny Jones, a politician with no police record, was placed on the extremist database along with thousands of others simply because she criticised the work of the police. Is that a solid definition of extremist? Opposing the view of the police? The concept of an individual being law-abiding, and yet by disagreeing with authority being considered a threat to the state, is to my mind anathema to the idea of Magna Carta and the restriction of arbitrary use of power. You may also recall that over the past few years a big debate has been had about the draft Communications Data Bill, better known as the Snoopers Charter. This was a bill which would have given permission for the collection, retention and access to all of our communications. The who, where, what, how of our telephone calls, text messages, web searches and location data, with nothing more than a sign-off from a Secretary of State or from a designated person within a police force. This data, known in America as metadata, can be very, very crucial to the fight against terrorism, child sex exploitation and serious crime. I don't doubt that. But it can also paint an incredibly detailed and accurate picture of an individual's life. Who they know, where they go, what they look at online, and so on. This might not sound intrusive or bothersome to some of you. You may be of the opinion that you've got nothing to hide and nothing to fear, that security is more important than what you do and where you go. But when the former director of the National Security Agency and the CIA in America was quoted as saying, "We kill people based on metadata," it might be worth giving that opinion some further thought. Because one day, your metadata might be scooped up by the police. The Snoopers Charter ground to a halt as there were concerns that what the Home Office was calling for was far too intrusive and would breach innocent people's privacy. However, a new bill is on its way, an investigatory powers bill, which may reprise some, if not all, of Snoopers Charter. The bill will be published later on in the autumn, and currently we don't know what will be in it. We can only guess. Last week, however, a report was published by David Anderson, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation. He made a number of excellent recommendations in it, some of which I believe should be considered in this new bill, particularly one that stated that judges should have the final say on approval for access to an individual's communications. Not the government, not the police, but a judge. And this is something that privacy campaigners such as myself have been campaigning for a very, very, very long time. Yet the recommendation was met with a muted response from the government and looks likely to be challenged further. You could argue that any refusal to allow judicial approval is the arbitrary power of the state overruling the rule of law. What's happening here is in sharp contrast to what's happening in America. Over in the USA, they have woken up to the fact that greater access to people's data does not actually mean better security for the country. In the aftermath of 9/11, the Americans introduced the Patriot Act, an act which, and I quote, united and strengthened America by providing appropriate tools to intercept and obstruct terrorism. Only thing is, Section 215 of the Act was used to intercept the communications of millions of innocent people. And even more worryingly, the interception failed to make the slightest bit of difference to the counter-terrorism investigations. And that's not the view of a privacy campaigner, that was the conclusion of a board set up by the government. A fortnight ago, the US Senate voted to scrap Section 215, effectively prohibiting the National Security Agency the powers to collect and store data. They are ensuring that there must be legal approval to access any communication, and that bulk data gathering must not be permitted without full legal justification. The very same thing the Senate are about to approve, number 10, are expressing profound concern at. Now, let me be clear. I am not in any way opposed to keeping the country safe. Just because I head up a privacy organisation does not mean I somehow think that everyone should be free to do as they please with no consequence whatsoever. There are bad people in the world, and they should be caught, and they should be dealt with. But monitoring all of society which in the main is made up of innocent, law-abiding citizens going about their daily business, in order to catch bad people, seems completely disproportionate to me. I believe you should target your attention on those you suspect, rather than watching everyone all the time. Before the new legislation is approved, I really hope that a healthy, honest and transparent debate will take place in the UK about surveillance law, that we don't have emergency legislation rammed through Parliament in a matter of hours as we've had in the past, and that there is discussion and debate amongst the general public and in the media, as well as in the House of Commons. Because what's about to happen in our society is that we're about to enter an age where technology will dictate absolutely everything we do. Our communications will no longer just be between each other, through our mobile telephone or through the internet on the computer. They will be with household appliances. It will be with our car, with energy systems, with our healthcare, with our education. Pretty much anything you can think of will be connected to the internet. It will be around us everywhere, and it will be controlling absolutely everything we do. Every facet of our life will be logged as an online communication. The reason I mention the future is that on Monday, at the Magna Carta celebration, David Cameron stated that what we do today will shape the world for many, many years to come. He also stated that Magna Carta's principles shine as brightly as ever, that liberty, justice, democracy, the rule of law are held dear, and that we should pledge to keep those principles alight. He couldn't be more right. And yet, if we agree to allow the police, the security agencies and the government to have access to our communications with no judicial oversight and approval, if we sit back and allow people to be called extremists with no definition as to what an extremist is, if we allow the threat of terrorism and the calls for security to overshadow us, what we do today will absolutely shape the future. And it will be a future where liberty, justice, democracy and the rule of law were once held dear, but will have become as meaningless as the other 61 long expired clauses of the Magna Carta. So, what has Magna Carta done for us? Well, the relevant clauses of Magna Carta today don't exactly fall trippingly from the tongue. They may not spring to people's minds with ease, but they are, I believe, interwoven into the fabric of our society. They have made us a great nation and have given us a rule of law. And as we go forward from this 800th celebration, we must ensure that they are not allowed to be unpicked in any way. Because if we do, we will have shaped a future which will bear absolutely no relevance to the past. Thank you.
Renate, what a great talk there. I agree with very much of it. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Adrian, for such a warm introduction to both of us. It's a great privilege to be here today. You know, I think Oxford mirrors the Magna Carta with its winding streets, its great quad, its organic colleges, each with their own traditions, decentralised and free. Well, relatively free, I think that is. Oxford is a Magna Carta city because of its organic nature, and I think Magna Carta is an organic document. Now, what has Magna Carta done for us? For hundreds of years, I think Magna Carta was at the very root of our laws and freedoms that we, as Britons, have enjoyed. At one level, Magna Carta has been supplanted, as we've heard. Just 3 clauses remain, and they're fairly irrelevant clauses. So Magna Carta, in practice, no longer exists, but in reality, I think it is very important to our futures. Magna Carta remains the cornerstone of the very idea of England and latterly Britain's justice and its constitution. It's the essence of liberty, it's the essence of light government, it's the essence of our sovereignty, and it's the essence of our freedom. And if that is true, it cannot be irrelevant. While legally it has been dimmed in this realm, I think it's the very cornerstone of much of the prosperous world, be it in America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and many other countries. Rather than say, well, that is that, the law has changed, let's rebuild a new architecture, I say let's rebuild England around Magna Carta, the common law, liberty, minimal and peaceful government. While Magna Carta does not explicitly talk about the common law, I believe it's its very heart. And I think the common law is critical to this debate because it is not a revolutionary code. It looks at precedent, it is conservative, it tends to be minimalist, and it gradually evolves as circumstances change. And I think it's the unsung genius of the English peoples in this conservatism, its pragmatism, paying due respect to the past, but allowing evolution as circumstances change. It's not based on the Napoleonic Code, the bizarre idea that wise men can sit down and develop a code for eternity, but rather look back as situations change and evolve with time. That is what Magna Carta was, and what I believe we should be aiming for today. But by moving towards the Napoleonic codified law, I think we risk the whim of popular fashion and dictate. And indeed, as the common law slowly subsides to the power of bureaucratic code, I think we're in danger, to quote Goya, of creating a rational monster. Every little law in themselves looks logical, be it a health and safety or a anti-privacy law, etc. But brought together, our freedoms are being greatly eroded. So I think Magna Carta, yes, as the lawyers would say amongst us, has been supplanted. It remains of critical importance. It was the acorn and beacon of our liberty and stability, although much of the law has been supplanted. Now, in this book published today, we're doing our best to get it on the bestsellers list because we're offering it for free. Magna Carta Today, a debate on the principles and relevance in the 21st century. We look at each of the 63 clauses and try to look at their relevance for today. And the reality is that the clauses, many of them, are not desperately relevant today, but what we have done is to basically group them into 10 broad categories. So we've looked at the Constitution, we've looked at religious freedom, quite an important part at the time of Magna Carta, but we've evolved that to freedom of speech. We've looked at justice, an area that Magna Carta is particularly strong on. We looked at family life and privacy. Magna Carta deals significantly with family life, and particularly inheritance. It was, after all, the barons that brought this document to the king, and they were extremely interested in their estates and inheritance. Magna Carta deals with border controls and weights and measures. It deals with taxation. It deals with debtors' rights, which we've translated to the obligations of bankers. And there's even a few passages on the environment, albeit those passages are there more to do with the ownership of assets, be they fishing rights or forestry rights. There are a number of clauses, nearly a dozen, which now have almost no relevance unless you're Welsh. It's how we deal with Welsh hostages, for example. But what we've tried to do in this grouping is to basically look at how we're doing in each of those 10 subjects. Now, you'll be pleased to hear I'm not going to go through all 10 areas today, but I thought I'd highlight 2 or 3 which I think are important. Now, Magna Carta actually says relatively little on the Constitution. Who guards the guardians? Effectively, the English state in the 13th century was extremely small. It was the King's Court. It was effectively military power. So there's very little about the balance of powers, the split between local government and national government. The pesky Scots weren't involved in those days, so we didn't need to bother about devolution. But as many of you will know, that King John in 1211 had surrendered the kingdom to the Pope in exchange for a rent of 1,000 gold marks a year and homage. Now, I think Magna Carta does represent a very strong expression of English sovereignty. And for that reason alone, if no other, I think Magna Carta remains highly relevant today, particularly in the light of the upcoming European Union referendum. I think Magna Carta shows that what has been given away can be won back. We'll see perhaps next year or the year after if that indeed is the case, but at least the people will have the chance to have a say in that matter. Now, Magna Carta, I think, takes for granted the sovereignty, certainly in temporal affairs, of the English nation. And certainly with the break with Rome in 1532 to 1973, England/Britain was indeed supreme in judicial matters. Since 1973, there's been a steady erosion of the common law with supranational statute law, from the EU growing incompetence from agriculture, fisheries, environment, single market regulation, health and safety. The list is fairly endless, including energy, transport and aspects of economic policy. And under the principle of acquis communicare, what we have, we hold. Once a power is given to the European Union, it's now impossible to get it back. So the EU is a power ratchet. And I would argue that the EU is the opposite of the Magna Carta. It's centralised, it's bureaucratic, and I would say fairly dictatorial in terms of its regulations, unlike the Magna Carta, based on common law, which is fairly minimalist and organic. We deal at some length in the book on religious freedom. Magna Carta talked about the right of England to choose its own bishops, obviously ultimately under the power of Rome. That isn't so relevant today, but freedom of speech surely is extremely relevant. Now, I think in Britain we've been pretty lucky for many years, really, hundreds of years, to have a relatively tolerant and enlightened attitude to free speech. However, the absolute concept of free speech has never existed, and I think the Tower of London bears witness to that. What is fashion changes and what's beyond the pale in previous generations may be acceptable today. It would have certainly been unwise or very brave to be a practicing Catholic in Elizabethan England. And indeed, if you'd bought that risky novel, Lady Chatterley's Lover, in 1963, you'd have had to go to Soho and take it out in a brown plastic bag. The blasphemy laws had fallen to abeyance, but it was actually only in 2008 that they were finally abolished. So there's never been absolute freedom of speech, and I don't think any society has ever had it. But I think many people feel, and I would certainly agree with that freedom of speech is actually under quite subtle attack now. The codification of hate crime, for example, the right to espouse certain ideas is increasingly difficult, be they on race or sexuality, while the egalitarian secular ideas are certainly classified as right think. And I don't think this is healthy. I think it is perfectly acceptable to believe the earth is flat. The scientists among you will know that theories are always being overthrown on a regular basis, and only by competition of ideas and within reason freedom to express unfashionable ideas can the best ideas flourish. Now, in this country, we've always enjoyed freedom of speech as a negative right. That has been codified now by the European Human Rights Act, and in a way what they say no one can really disagree with. It all sounds extremely reasonable. You can say what you like as long as it's not done in a threatening or intimidating or insulting way. But the problem with this codification, it results in legal creep. So what effectively happens is something that is perfectly reasonable as a starting point, and something that would be seen as insulting to a wide group of people can actually be morphed into the much more questionable definition when an incident is perceived as offensive or racist by the victim himself or any other person in the room. That closes down debate and argument. So I think we're living in an age of self-censorship. To some extent that's always been the case, but now I think the areas which are difficult to discuss are migration, sexuality, equality, and even aspects of climate change. And there is a fashion in these aspects. So I think freedom is being curtailed. I think, ironically, some of the European human rights legislation curtails freedoms in a way that it was designed to have the opposite effect of what I think was intended. Justice. Magna Carta is rightly lauded for its attitude to justice. I think you know many of the clauses. It led in time to habeas corpus, and I think that British justice is still perceived amongst the fairest in the world. However, Westminster is increasingly prescriptive on legal tariffs and is reducing judicial discretion. Renate touched on some of these issues in a broader sense. I don't intend to go down that route. But that certainly is a threat to the common law and some of the Magna Carta principles. But I think specifically the European arrest warrant, which Adrian mentioned, which basically creates a common market in arrest without common standards, is of grave concern. And the reason I think that is in this country you are innocent until proven guilty. That is not the case in every European country. It's not to say that there are not fair trials in Germany or France. Of course there are. The traditions are extremely different. And indeed in some European countries you can be banged up for 18 months without charges, which clearly goes against habeas corpus as a concept. Clearly, Britain has always extradited people, and there are circumstances that should happen. But the absolute automatic extradition, I think, is extremely dangerous. Renate has talked about family life and privacy. I don't intend to go down that route. But the barons were pretty concerned about preserving their wealth, as you might imagine. But what I would say is on our section on taxation, we've kept it pretty simple. We've just effectively said that King John would be somewhat delighted if he couldn't believe his luck if he came back to this country today to find the state to 50% of GDP. I suspect that is five, possibly 10 times as great as was his share in the 13th century. So, to conclude, I think Magna Carta was an expedient document. It wasn't some sort of God-given Moses 10 commandments. This was done to limit raw power of the king. Despite that, I think it was an enlightened document. And I think it is an acorn from which many of our liberties have sprung. It's an expression of small government, it's an expression of consistent government. It's an expression of the end of the arbitrary power of the king, which leads very gradually over many centuries to constitutional government, finding its greatest expression, I think, between 1536 and 1973. From Magna Carta sprung the Charter of the Forest, which was much more interested in the rights of the common man. The Habeas Corpus Act of 1678 codified the rights that Magna Carta, and indeed well before Magna Carta, had been allowed in this country. Certainly, it's evolved. It should be seen as a starting point, but I think if we throw it away, we are going to have a very different nation indeed. But since 1973, we've taken aboard a very different route, and much of it comes from continental Europe, where statute law and decree are much more common. To my mind, and this is not a chauvinistic point, it just comes down to the basis of law, the genius of our country has been common law, and that is basically, I think, what marks out the Anglosphere from continental Europe, because it's resulted in, I think, peaceful, prosperous and fairly stable government. And that's because the common law draws the tradition and precedent and the wisdom of the past, while allowing for evolutionary innovation. Codified law at times is very enlightened, but it does risk fashion, whim and upheaval. And I think it's the primary view why, if you look at virtually every European country, continental European country, there has been numerous revolutions and change. While the Anglosphere has, of course, we've had our moments and strife, but generally have been more stable. Now, I think it is a matter for concern that this country is being sucked into the codified European model. It's a much bigger issue for Britain and probably Ireland, actually, than it is for the European countries because of the different route of our law. And I think the risk of basically being brought into a more codified nature of law is that you have a flip-flop from one modish idea to another, a lack of stability and continuity. But let's be clear that Westminster is very much to blame here as Brussels. And slowly but surely, I think our ancient liberties are being eroded and supplanted by these new, and I would say, alien concepts. By ditching Magna Carta, we risk arbitrary law. You know, I think it's rather like saying that this great college begun in 1524 and added to very gradually and sympathetically is now no good. It doesn't meet the modish climate change insulation targets, expensive to heat, it's elitist and it serves just one community. It's a bit old-fashioned, it's not right thing. So let's call in the ghost of Corbusier and rebuild some rational concrete bunker, maybe this is it, and open it to the Druids, Zoroastrians and Richard Dworkins. But, you know, let us forget the past at our peril. For hundreds of years, the principles of Magna Carta and the common law and light government did us proud. I think Magna Carta, yes, it was an acorn, yes, it was supplanted, but the idea behind it was the route map. And now on the 800th anniversary, I think it's time to relearn the lessons that our forefathers have developed over many hundreds of years and return to small, peaceful, quiet, stable government under the common law. That's what Magna Carta has given us, our very birthright.